It is a real pleasure to be here and to welcome you all. We're going to talk tonight about the Cone Sisters of Baltimore, about Matisse, and about other paintings too, to try to give you a sense of the whole Cone experience, shall we say. I want to talk for a minute about the book I wrote with my mother, Ellen Hirshland, who you see there on the far right. She had worked on this project for decades, and it really was her life work, which I joined her to write this book that you see here on the left, and which I know some of you have already read. We based the book on three main sources. First of all, my mother had been very close to one of the sisters, Etta, and had kept notes for about 50 years on her recollections of Etta Cone. And she also remembered Clarabelle, although she had been a child when Clarabelle died. Secondly, my mother had interviewed people over the course of about 50 years, hunting down all kinds of people who had known the Cone sisters and who could remember stories about them. And then thirdly, we used the letters, about 3,000 pages of letters, most of which were written from Clarabelle to Etta. Very few of Etta's letters survived. Now, these sisters wrote each other sometimes several letters a day, and sometimes up to 30-page letters at a time. So this was a really colossal task that my mother was tackling. And then when I jumped in to participate, I put everything on computers, and it made it much easier for us to exchange ideas back and forth about what we thought we should put in the book. I brought along an envelope which was written by Clarabelle to Etta during the war, during the First World War, when Clarabelle spent those years, the war years, and several years afterwards, in Munich. And I don't know if you can see it from where you sit, but it says censor across the top and opened by here, so it's opened by censor. And it's fascinating to read Clarabelle's letters from Munich during the war. Just imagine a single American woman living in a hotel, a formerly very fancy hotel in Munich, although nothing was fancy during World War I because people were starving. So those were our sources for the book that we wrote together. Here you have the two sisters that we are talking about. Clarabelle, the doctor, who never practiced as a clinician, but she was a very distinguished researcher and worked in pathology, wrote several very distinguished articles, both in the United States and in Germany. And also she taught at Johns Hopkins Medical School, which was no small accomplishment for a woman in the late 19th century. Etta, in contrast, did not go beyond high school, but she was very well educated in the arts because she was self-taught. You see Etta here at the age of 25 on the right in a riding costume, and obviously posed, and Clarabelle at age 31 on the left. Now, both sisters were very stylish, and they would wear elegant hats and scarves and capes. And on the right, 70 years after here's Clarabelle with all this get-up that she's wearing. 70 years later, there is my mother wearing a cape that belonged to Clarabelle. Of course, Clarabelle was long gone. She died in 29. But the cape came down to my mother, and I brought it here to Indianapolis so that you could get a sense for these ladies. Look at this gorgeous thing. This is the inside, and my mother loved to do this, to put it on. And look at these look at the lining here. You know, can you just imagine Clarabelle sweeping through the streets in her, she was very short, much shorter than I am. So this thing must have sort of dragged in the gutter, but, and I want to particularly bring to your attention, if I can get out of here again, the color. I mean, it's a gorgeous black velvet with a satin interior in a color, a sort of maroonish purple that both sisters loved. They loved lavender and purple. And this one is a good example of Clarabelle's love for that color. Now, the two sisters, Clarabelle and Etta, were part of a large family. And in this family of the Cohns, there were 3 girls and 10 boys. The third girl, by the way, was my great-grandmother. That's how I'm related to this, to the aunts, the great-great-aunts. Now, the 2 oldest boys in the family were Moses Cohn and Caesar Cohn, who you see here as young men, about 1880. At the stage when they were going from Baltimore, where their parents lived, to North Carolina to buy cloth for their father to sell in his general store. They lived in Baltimore because there was a large Jewish community there, and so the Cohns had moved from Tennessee to Baltimore to join that German Jewish community. And the brothers eventually set up their own textile works in North Carolina. Here's a plaque in Greensboro. Cohn brothers, Moses and Caesar Cohn, pioneered marketing of textiles, manufactured denim and flannel. Their first mill, Proximity, 1895, was a quarter of a mile from this sign in Greensboro. The reason that it's called Proximity Mill is because, and here it is, Proximity Manufacturing Company. It still exists. It doesn't work, but it's still there. The reason they called it Proximity really tells you everything about the cotton industry in the 19th century. Up until the 1880s or so, the manufacturing of cotton was all done in New England, along with the making of shoes, leather shoes. That was a New England industry, but the cotton was grown in the South, so it had to go, once the cotton was harvested, it was shipped to New England and turned into cloth. Well, the Cohn brothers got the idea, a very important idea, I might add, to make the cloth where the cotton grew. hence the word proximity. They put the mills right next to where the cotton grew. They had several mills. The Proximity was the first one. This postcard is another mill called White Oak, named for a tree that was right there. And then a third mill, these are all in Greensboro, Revolution Mill, which still exists and is now a sort of craft center. The two Cone brothers, and then eventually some of those other 11 brothers, went into the business. Actually, all of the brothers who survived, two of them did not survive past childhood, but all of them at one point or another worked in the two oldest brothers' Cone mills. Now, Moses, the older of the two brothers, was very close to Edda in particular, of all his siblings. And the letter survives where he invites Edda and Clarabelle, the two unmarried sisters, to go around the world with him and his wife. This was in 1907. For Baltimoreans to go around, or for anybody for that matter, to go around the world in 1907 was extremely unusual. Here you see the foursome on an elephant in India. And there is Moses. I hope you can see the arrow up there. This is Moses' wife, Bertha, Edda, and Clarabelle, all riding, it's a wonderful picture, isn't it? In 1907. And I believe that some of the Cone's sisters' interest in the kinds of things you have in your exhibit here, the fabrics, the pottery, the jugs, the pewter, that kind of thing. I think they learned to love that kind of bric-a-brac, which is not maybe the right word, but you know what I mean. When they were traveling and collecting things and bringing these Oriental things home with them back to Baltimore. Well, it's a lucky thing they went in 1907, because in 1908, Moses died very young, at the age of 51. And that was the end of that. Actually, Edda went into deep mourning for her brother for several years. Now, let's back up for a moment and look at the parents of those 13 children. Here we have Herman Cone, who was an immigrant to the United States, first to Virginia, then Tennessee, and then Baltimore. He always had a very strong German accent, didn't speak that good English. I can say that because the letters that he wrote are pretty atrocious English. They're charming, but I don't think he ever got his grammar right. Same with his wife, also an immigrant. Helen Cone here. You see them playing cards in their home in Baltimore, which is, I think, very revealing. Here we are looking at a typical Victorian living room with wallpaper with lots of little flowers all over it, pictures on the wall, some family photos and that kind of thing. This is the mantelpiece, and you see how it's draped with cloth. That was a very common Victorian way of decorating your living room. And that's the home in which Clarabelle and Edda grew up. We have to keep that in mind when we look at this amazing exhibition that you have here at the IMA. Now, when Herman Cohn died in 1897, Moses gave Etta $300, which was a lot of money in those days, to buy something to spruce up their mother's parlor. And I'm sure that nobody dreamt of what Etta would do with that $300. What she did is she went to New York, where she saw some paintings by an artist, a recently deceased artist, called Theodore Robinson. And she liked those paintings. So she commissioned an agent to buy as many of the paintings. She told the agent which ones she liked. She said, please buy as many Theodore Robinsons as you can get for $300. And she got five paintings, of which you see 2 here. Now, Theodore Robinson, an American painter, was an excellent Impressionist artist who had worked in France with Monet. And I think you can see that he was an Impressionist in these 2 works. The one on the right, The Watering Place, was Etta's favorite. But actually, they're really beautiful. They're all beautiful, I think. And what a shock that must have been when you think of the house that Etta grew up in. Now, why she decided to buy these paintings for her mother, we don't really know, except that she had some kind of innate sense for what was good. Nobody told her this is, what you should buy. Nobody was buying Robinson. Nobody was buying Impressionism. Almost nobody had ever heard of these people. So it was a remarkable leap for Etta to take. And I'd like to throw out the idea to you all that although Etta was a calmer, meeker person than Claribel, who was bold and brassy, that Etta was actually the leader in the purchase and study of art. And she is the one who led Claribel to become a great art collector. The Cohn sisters sailed in 1903 from New York to Naples, Italy, where they were met by Gertrude and Leo Stein. I cannot really overemphasize the importance of the Steins in the development of appreciation of the Cohn sisters, who learned a great deal, especially from Leo Stein, Gertrude's brother. I love this photograph of Claribel, Gertrude Stein, and Etta in a wonderful hat, sitting in Fiesole, which is a small village outside of Florence, in 1903. This was actually Etta's second trip abroad. She had gone over in 1901 as well, but that was not involved with the Cohns. Now, what was the importance of the Steins? First of all, Leo took Etta by the hand, I don't mean literally, but he may have literally, to see the Italian Renaissance artworks in Italy. That was a very good place to start learning about art history. And Gertrude, when they all reassembled in Paris, Gertrude introduced the Cohn sisters to her friend Pablo Picasso. That was probably, almost certainly, so that the Cohns, who had more money than the Steins, would purchase. Gertrude Stein hoped that they would buy some of Picasso's drawings, and they did, which was very good for Picasso, who was starving, literally starving, had no heat. He was extremely poor. So the Cohens supposedly picked up drawings that were sort of scattered around the floor and bought them for the equivalent of about $2 each, which was a lot more money than it is today, but still not that much money. And they were wonderful drawings. Again, the Cohens striking out with a totally unknown artist. There was no appreciation for Picasso in 1903. Now, when they got home, when the Cohen sisters got home, well, Edda took to collecting American comics, which she knew Picasso liked, that, you know, in the newspapers. And she sent a bunch of American comics to Picasso, just as a present. And Picasso thanked her with this drawing, which is on the back side of our book. Bonjour, Mademoiselle Cohen. And he's doffing his hat to her. And it's a very good likeness. Picasso had a big lock of hair that always drooped down over his forehead. He really looked like this. And Edda wrote back and said, she wrote back to Picasso's girlfriend, live-in girlfriend, and said, please thank Pablo for his charming photograph, but please tell him he should do something about his big tummy. Now, the relationship between, I hope everybody knows about Gertrude Stein, a very avant-garde writer in the early to mid 20th century, whose writing is even today quite difficult to read. Believe me, I've tried it. It's very repetitive, and it's not normal syntax. It's sort of lilting and rhythmical, in a way kind of a parallel to what Picasso was doing in Cubism in the early part of the 20th century. Now, one part of this story which I need to share with you is that on these travels back and forth to Paris, to Italy, and especially Paris, and also in Baltimore, it's pretty clear that Edda and Gertrude Stein were having a lesbian relationship. We know that Gertrude had many close female friends, and we don't know much about Edda's private life in that regard, but there are hints that they were very close, indeed intimate. Well, that lasted for a number of years, but then along came Alice B. Toklas, who became Gertrude Stein's lifelong lover and partner. And in this wonderful photograph by Man Ray, a famous photographer, we have Alice B. Toklas sitting in Gertrude's apartment, what had been Gertrude's and Leo's apartment, but Leo moved out because 3 is a crowd, and Gertrude sitting here with Picasso's and Braque. No, this is the Braque. And most of the pictures are hard to make out, but those two, perhaps you can see, a Picasso girl and a Braque still life there. Anyway, when Alice B. Toklas came on the scene, this clearly caused problems for Edda, who no longer was part of Gertrude's inner circle. Neither of the Cohen sisters liked Alice Toklas at all. You can see why Edda didn't, because she was supplanted by a new lover, but Gertrude didn't like her. Claribel didn't like her either. And Alice Toklas turns up very often in the letters of the Cohn sisters, but this is how she's described. Her name is never properly written. So you have Taklos, Taklas, Toklas, Taklos, Taklos, a little bit like tactless. Anyway, I think this was some kind of Freudian hostility that showed up in the Cohn sisters' letters, even when they wrote Gertrude Stein. Now, this wonderful picture of the Cohn sisters captures them beautifully. I remember Edda Cohn very well. I was 7 years old when she died in 1949. I saw her often. My family and I went regularly to Baltimore to visit my grandparents who lived there. And we always visited Edda when we were there. By the way, we never called her Edda. Nobody did. She was either Miss Edda to other people, or in our family, she was Aunt Edda. But here I am calling her Edda. Edda and Claribel. Now, they almost always wore black dresses down to their ankles. Think of this, all through the 20s, with the flapper dresses, everybody's dresses came up around the knees. They never changed their clothing from 19th century dress. And they usually had a white collar or some kind of light thing around their necks. And they used to wear fantastic jewelry. I have an example up here. But big Renaissance jewelry on their bosoms. Quite, even for a little kid, as I was, it was momentous and unforgettable the way they looked. And I think this photograph catches them rather well. Now, although they were extremely conservative in their dress, they were anything but in their choice of artworks. One of the things that they collected, and it's in the title of my talk, as you know, The Old Lace, was lace, which both of them, Edda and Claribel, became experts at studying and learning about. So there's an example on the right of 17th century French lace. They had each of them had a large lace collection. And I'd like to look with you at this list that Claribel made. Claribel was a big list maker. And here, list of things to do. This was on a notepad to herself. Let's look at this. Look for corsets. Place bedroom slippers in unreadable. Look over scarves. Look over white lace. Look over black lace. Alcohol in bottles, whatever that means. Change corset, old pink for new salmon. Count lace, white. Count lace, black. I mean, I'm reading it because it's so incredible. Count jewelry, place jewelry. Can you imagine making a list like this for yourself? She was really compulsive, to put it mildly. Here's another example of lace. This piece belonged to Louis XIV. Now, if that isn't historic, I don't know what is. What a shocker. When we move from the delicacy of that lace and from the black black-dressed ladies that you just saw a moment ago with the conservative dress to this painting by Matisse, it's almost incomprehensible how Claribel bought this painting, how she could go for such a modern picture that when it was shown in the Armory show, first in New York, but then in Chicago in 1913, the Art Students League of Chicago burned this picture in effigy. Now you think of the Art Students League as being the most modern, the most open-minded of artists and art appreciation folk. But no, they hated this painting. How an older lady from conservative Baltimore could have the stomach to buy this is truly amazing, I think. It's even hard to take in the 21st century, over 100 years after it was painted, for many people. So what was Matisse doing? He is stretching the boundaries. He is painting a woman with exaggerated features of her body. By the way, this painting is not here in Indianapolis because it is at the Armory Show retrospective in New York City. Otherwise, I think it would have been here, but there are a lot of other good things here. Notice how Matisse repeats the shape of her buttocks here in the palm branch here behind. The whole thing is a study of shapes, of color, of distortion, of abstraction. It's a really cutting-edge picture that almost nobody could understand. It had been bought by Leo Stein, who was very avant-garde in his taste, and then by Claribel. Please note that I am trying to say who bought what picture. The sisters never considered themselves a Kohn collection, having a Kohn collection, until after Claribel died. They always had Etta's collection and Claribel's collection, completely distinct from each other. This is the room where in Claribel's apartment, the blue nude room, she called it, with a very narrow room. All the rooms were narrow. And by the way, there were 3 apartments. There was Claribel, Etta in the middle, like a railroad car. There were a series of them. And then their youngest brother, Fred, had the 3rd apartment. And Claribel and Fred would have dinner in Etta's apartment. She was the homemaker of the 3. And Claribel was always late, every night. And Etta would fret because the food would be getting cold and her cook didn't like it when people came late. This was a constant source of friction between the sisters. Notice all the chest here, the huge, probably Renaissance or Baroque chest with all kinds of decoration, this huge book on the top, another chest, books, another case here. It was just crammed full of things in the Kohn apartments. Another of Claribel's truly great purchases was this late work of Cézanne, of the mountain called Mont Saint-Victoire. The mountain here seems to hang over the quarry stones that are below. It's one of the most dynamic of Cézanne's late works, and again, a truly amazing purchase the most expensive painting that either sister ever bought. Now, another of Claribel's lists. Here she was buying works by Cézanne and Matisse and other people. And here's a list. Hair wash. Bernheim Jeune, that was a gallery in Paris, one of the best galleries in Paris. Pay 32,500 francs. That was a lot of money. I don't know which painting it was for, but it's a lot of money that she had to pay them. Then something, Bon Marché skirts. Bon Marché was a department store. I think it still exists. Drugs, 20 francs. Alcohol, 1 pint. I don't know what that is. Borax, probably 1 franc. What kind of a list is that? With your very expensive painting of this for this amount, and then your borax for this amount. It's really hard to understand exactly how Claribel ticked, but I think it's very interesting. Now, Claribel died in 1929, and that was devastating for Edda, who decided to make a memorial volume for her sister. And that memorial volume, which put paintings from both their collections together for the first time, came out in 1934, dedicated to the memory of Claribel. And for this purpose, Edda asked her friend Matisse if he would make some drawings of Claribel to put in the front, to make at least one to put as a frontispiece. Well, this is one of the drawings that Matisse made, and I believe that Matisse, working in Paris, he knew Claribel very well, but hadn't seen, well, she had died. I think he used this newspaper article in the Baltimore Sun, the Evening Sun, which is was the evening paper of the Baltimore Sun. This was 1911, so that was 20 years before Matisse was working on this drawing. Doesn't it look as if he's using that as a memory device? Look at the way he catches that eyebrow, and it's so related. I think he had this newspaper, and it helped him to make what I think is a magnificent drawing of Claribel, which I'm afraid is not here in the show. He made, in the end, 4 drawings of Claribel and 6 of Edda. And he offered to give them to Edda as a gift. And Edda said, "No, I'm going to pay you for them." And she did, the honorable lady that she was. This is one of Matisse's drawings of Edda that was, all 10 portraits were published in this memorial volume, which is a big book like this. And this is another slightly earlier drawing of Edda. I mean, it's actually an etching, which I think is particularly beautiful, so I wanted to show it to you. It's by a Baltimore artist called Ben Silbert, who I think was a very good artist. And what I like so much here is that you can see the sensitivity of Edda's face, where, as I said, Claribel was stunning. She looked like a queen. People actually said that to her. Edda was gentle and thoughtful and sensitive. And I think you can see this especially well in the Silbert drawing, etching here. Now, in this photograph of Matisse, on the left, here's Matisse relaxing. First of all, you can see this painting of a table and his dog on a pillow and leaves in a vase. You can see that on the wall behind him. Edda bought that painting. And you can also see one of the 6 drawings that he did of Edda on an easel here, and there's another one tacked up on the wall there. So it's kind of interesting to see the Edda portraits in progress here. This is an interesting story. This painting, of course, is in the show here. Large cliff fish bought by Edda. Well, I shouldn't give it away. When Edda saw this painting in Matisse's studio in Paris, at first she liked it very much. It shows Étretat, which is a natural arch, rock arch that was painted often by Monet. Some of you may recognize it. Anyway, she liked this painting, but then she suddenly said, "Oh, I'm not going to buy it after all." And Matisse, quite disconcerted, thinking he had made a sale, said, "What, Miss Cohn, why not? Why did you change your mind?" She said, "Because those fish on the beach there are dying, and I don't want to have dead fish in my house." And he said, "Oh no, Miss Cohn, I had somebody standing by pouring water on the fish." And she bought the picture. Good salesmanship, don't you think? And in 1930, Matisse came over to the United States. It was his only trip to this country. He came over because there had been a foul-up with something he had painted for the Barnes, Dr. Barnes and the Barnes Foundation. But while he was in Philadelphia visiting Barnes, he just took the train down to Baltimore to visit his old friend Edda Cohn. And here you see him in her dining room with the cliff and fish painting right behind him, which I think is rather a nice, it sort of places him in her house. The large reclining nude is a painting that Matisse clearly wanted Edda to buy to go with the blue nude, which Clarabelle had bought many, many years earlier. So Matisse sent Edda all those drawings that you have beautifully displayed here in the museum in black and white. He sent black and white photographs to Edda, saying to her, "I thought you might like to see the process that I went through to create this rather abstract picture of a nude." And in fact, much to Matisse's joy, Edda bought the large reclining nude, which used to be called the pink nude, as a sort of parallel to the blue nude, which still maintains that title. And here you see the pink nude in Clarabelle's apartment, although Clarabelle had died long ago, but it was always called Clarabelle's apartment, even though she wasn't there anymore. So the pink nude hangs right across the room from the blue nude. It did in Clarabelle's apartment. And you could not get distant from either one of them, both very powerful pictures. But there was so much clutter in the room, and the room was so narrow that there was no way to get a sense of distance from either one of them. quite overpowering they were. I thought you would like this slide of the large reclining nude in the subway of New York. And this is when there was a show at the Jewish Museum about 3 or 4 years ago. And I just think it's remarkable to have this daring, cutting-edge painting of Matisse, which, when it was painted, hardly anybody was interested in, now on display. I mean, not now, but when the show was on in New York, in such a public space as the subway. This beautiful painting of interior flowers, parakeets, a gem of a painting. I hope you will all take a good look at it closely if you haven't already. Has a cage here with parakeets in it. Well, that's only an understatement, really, because Matisse had his apartment full of parakeets. Here you see a photograph by the French photographer Cartier-Bresson. And my mother, who visited Matisse frequently over the course, well, every day over the course of a month when she was traveling with Edda in 1936, my mother said it was unbelievable. You'd go into his apartment and there were birds flying everywhere. So they weren't necessarily, well, they weren't caged. He did have some cages, obviously, but he didn't keep the birds in the cage. So I think this picture is quite a telling, the photograph is quite a telling one. We are talking mainly about Matisse tonight, but we have already looked at Cézanne earlier. I wanted to mention another very important painting that Edda bought in the late 30s, not long before the war broke out. This beautiful Gauguin of a woman, his mistress in Tahiti, where Gauguin lived, having abandoned his Danish wife and numerous children back in France and Denmark. Anyway, this lovely Tahitian woman who was a fraction the age of Gauguin probably is pregnant in the picture. It's called Woman with a Mango. Here's the mango. And I think it's one of the great Gauguins, one of the greatest Gauguins, again showing Edda's phenomenal taste. You have beautiful Gauguins in this museum, by the way. Notice the color purple. That was such a frequent choice of both sisters. This painting, also a gem, which is full of pattern and color, of an odalisque. You know, the word odalisque is a French word, but it comes from the Turkish word for room. Oda is a room, so it means a woman of the house, really. And it's an Oriental woman, or actually a French woman in Oriental dress, which was very popular among many artists, French and otherwise. And you can see that she's wearing pantaloons and a rather decorated purple jacket. And many, many patterns that you would think wouldn't go together, but somehow Matisse pulls it off. Now, this is a corner of Edda's sitting room. I wanted to give you a sense of how the pictures worked in terms of her apartment. We've just looked at the Gauguin, which you can see there on the wall. And we also just looked at the odalisque with left knee bent and there it is on the other wall. And we also looked at this picture of the table with the dog underneath, and you can see it back there just through the doorway. So here we have a sort of clumping, one picture on top of another. Each one of these pictures is an unbelievable gem. And from this one angle of Edda's sitting room, you could see so many great works. And I haven't even mentioned this sculpture by Renoir there, and the Hispano-Moresque furniture, and you know that was full of fabrics and chests and so on from earlier pictures. This is the apartment building where the Cohn sisters and their brother Fred lived. And there is now a plaque, which is rather nice, I think. The Cohn sisters with their dates, early collectors of Matisse, Picasso, and other modern artists. Their preeminent collection, housed in 2 apartments here, they left out poor Fred, now fills the Baltimore Museum of Art's Cohn wing. It's a nice tribute to the sisters. Whoops. And I wanted you to see what the hallway looked like in their apartment. This is what I remember. I remember feeling sort of cramped, even though I was a child. And my mother always said that to walk down here, you felt as if you had to sort of sidle down sideways, because even though the hallway was very narrow to begin with, there was furniture and here rugs and pictures. There's one of Matisse's drawings of Edda, by the way. So I think you get a sense for what this Edda's apartment and Clarabelle's apartment looked like. Here again, the 2 drawings that we've already looked at that Matisse did for the memorial volume. I think they are splendid statements catching the personalities of these 2 great ladies who formed the collection that we can all appreciate here in your museum. Thank you.